Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. It's been more than 2 years since I've done a Samyang review, and I didn't know if I'd ever end up doing one again. However, I happened to be in Tokyo at CP Plus, stopped by their booth just to get a little FaceTime, and turns out that they were announcing a brand new lens, a brand new partnership. In that 2-year period, Samyang has completely rebranded as LK Samyang, and this lens was a partnership with the legendary German optical company Schneider-KREUZNACH. And so I was very interested at this collaboration because it showed a seriousness of intent of maybe moving a little bit more upscale with this zoom. And in particular, when I looked at a zoom range that I love, 14 to 24 millimeters with a maximum aperture of f2.8, and saw that they had managed to dramatically shrink the footprint and the weight of the lens, adding the ability to use traditional screw-in filters. And on top of that, having a lens that has a really fantastic minimum focus distance and up-close performance. And I was very intrigued, and I hoped that I would have an opportunity to spend a little bit more time than just a few minutes at a booth with it. Well, fortunately, I have at this point. This is the most expensive LK Samyang lens that I've ever tested at $1,200. So, as they've moved a little bit more upmarket with this lens, is it worth that kind of money? Well, that's what we're here to explore in today's review. We're going to dive into that right after a word from our sponsor. Today's episode is sponsored by the all-new Fantom Tracker 2.0. Fantom has not only seriously upgraded the visual look of the card, but now we have a superior build quality made with tempered glass and metal alloys. This credit card size tracker can be locally tracked via a 90 decibel beeping noise, but also on a global level via Apple's Find My Network and its map. The addition of NFC means that you can also use the card to trigger an automation. Just tap it. The tracker fits perfectly in any wallet or bag and assures you won't lose your valuables. It has a built-in rechargeable battery that can be easily charged via any wireless charger, and a single charge can last up to 6 months. The Fantom Tracker 2.0 makes for a seriously cool gift, so visit store.fantomwallet.com and use code Dustin20 at checkout for 20% off. That's store.fantomwallet.com and use code Dustin20 for 20% off. Now, before we start the review proper, I do want to give you disclosure. This lens was sent to me by LK Samyang for testing and review. They have had no input on my review itself, nor are they seeing this review before you do. As always, this is a completely independent review. So let's talk about the build and design here. First of all, I definitely noted a different look when I was doing the unboxing, a little more upscale experience, and definitely different fonts and logos a part of the process itself. I reviewed the Sigma 14 to 24 millimeter f2.8 art a year after I had reviewed their 14 to 24 millimeter on DSLR. So that was 2018 and 2019. I actually loved both of those lenses. I thought they were really fantastic, and they were my favorite of the Sigma wide angle zooms. But the one downside of the 14 to 24 millimeter DN art lens was it was quite big and heavy, and of course its design meant that no traditional filtering could be used. And I actually even reviewed some rear filtering options to try to circumvent that as a part of the process. It was 32% longer, and it was a whopping 78% heavier than this lens. And so they have done something really significant in this Schneider LK Samyang partnership in reducing the footprint of this lens, I think making it a much more accessible lens to a wide variety of people. I love the idea of the size and weight of this lens because this is the kind of lens that I often would like to take when I'm traveling. Whether you're doing city-related thing or landscape-related photography, in both of those cases, having a wide-angle zoom like this is really fantastic. But if the lens is too big and too heavy to pack along, sometimes it's going to get left aside, and I'm going to pack a compact prime instead. And so I love the idea of this lens if the reality holds up. It is 84 millimeters or 3.2 inches in diameter, and it is 98.6 millimeters or 3.9 inches in length. Now, what's interesting is that they are giving you the actual longer focal length. There is a very mild inner barrel extension, actually at 14 millimeters, which retracts fully by 24 millimeters. And so at the 24 millimeter position, it's actually only 88.8 millimeters in length, and so making it about 12 millimeters shorter. And so that obviously increases the gap even further when it comes to other lenses at how compact this can be for travel. It also weighs in at only 445 grams, or 15.7 ounces, which is a really fantastic weight for this kind of extreme wide angle zoom. Very, very impressive. And it is still just as wide. It goes as wide as 114.2 degrees and then zooms into 84 degrees. That's identical to the Sigma, and so it's not like they've cheated in the zoom range in any kind of way. Now, equally fantastic is the fact that up front we have a very common 77 millimeter front filter thread. We have a lens hood that is removable and reversible for storage. Again, that's a lot of fantastic, because it means also that you have a traditional pinch cap for the front rather than one of those larger caps that has to fit over the whole fixed lens hood assembly. So as far as portability, this gets fantastic marks all across the board. Just to give you another point of comparison, not on Sony FE, but on Nikon Z mount, the Nikkor, they also have a 14-24 millimeter F2.8. It is 124.5 millimeters in length and weighs 650 grams, and so considerably longer, considerably heavier. That lens cost $2,000. The Sigma costs a little over $1,500. And this lens at $1,200, while that's upmarket for an LK Samyang lens, it's still a relative bargain compared to the other options that cover this focal length and maximum aperture combination. And so is it a plastic fantastic then? You know, it's not. The build quality feels good. It does have some density to it. And there is a combination of metals and then also some engineered plastics, but you can feel when you tap them or when you try to squeeze, it is all good quality materials. The overall design is clean. We'll talk a little bit more about the rings in just a moment, but they've got a chrome accent ring. They've got a hidden blue ring here instead of a hidden red ring. And I don't know if that is a pointing towards the German part of the collaboration here or what. But anyway, a slightly different optical design and a little bit different a look, but beautifully compact, and build quality feels just fine. That includes a thorough weather sealing with 7 different seal points inside the lens itself. And now we have a sealed USB-C port as well. And that's kind of the same approach that Tamron uses, where it's exposed, but it is a weather seal port. And in this case, what that allows you to do is to finally get away from the lens station, which has been a part of the reality with Samyang lenses. And so for doing firmware updates or other customizable tweaks, you can do that without having that dock, which is a fantastic move by Samyang. And so you do have the ability to tweak some of the function and not just do firmware updates, but customize some of the function. And so that includes, one of the things that I did is I changed the speed of the manual focus ring, which was a little bit fast for my taste, and so I slowed that down, and that helped. And then another option that you had is that you can control what the AF/MF switch does, and so rather than it just being the ring doing nothing during AF mode, you can program it as I did, and so you can use it as an aperture ring if you so desire. Obviously, when you switch to MF, it's just going to become the manual focus ring once again. So it allows it to behave a little bit like Nikon's customizable control ring, though with maybe fewer options attached to it. But I found that to be beneficial as well. As mentioned, we do have that AF/MF switch, and we do have a function or custom button. Works just like any other lens. Function is set from within the camera itself. The zoom ring is it's not a big throw. I estimate it to be around 30 degrees, and so you can do that fairly quickly. Now, if you're moving really slowly, I find that the weight is mostly consistent. It just changes a little bit at around 21 millimeters, and that's when the lens is fully retracted. But even so, as I've been using the lens, it's already smoothed out, and so it's making it easier and easier to zoom in and out while doing, during video, for example. And so I appreciate that it's improving in the overall feel. The manual focus ring, the It's got a kind of a very old school rubberized texture. It kind of reminds me of some of Canon's old L series lenses from the EF era. And so I don't necessarily love the aesthetic of it. However, the feel is fine. It's a little light for my taste, but it feels fine overall. And obviously very different textures here to distinguish between these two rings. Now, one of the other kind of killer features here is that you can focus as closely at 18 centimeters, and on the 24mm end, that is going to give you a maximum magnification of 0.26 times. And that blows away any of the competing lenses, all of which live at the 0.13 or 0.14 level. And so you get a much higher level of magnification with this lens. And it's actually quite good up close. And so that just opens up, I love lenses like this because it opens up a whole lot of different possibilities for what you can do in as far as storytelling when you're out with a lens like this. You have 9 rounded aperture blades inside. You know, obviously it's a wide angle lens, so you're not going to see a whole lot of big specular highlights out of it, but it does a reasonable job of keeping a circular shape. And what's more, as you stop the lens down, that turns into an 18-pointed sun star that looks good. Not best I've ever seen, but looks good enough. No problems there. Overall, this is an amazingly attractive package, I would say, particularly because of that compact size, ability to filter it, and those close focus capabilities. How about the autofocus side? That hasn't always been, Samyang's talk strength, but in the 2 years since I've last done a review, I'm pretty impressed by how good this lens is. It uses a linear STM focus motor, and the focus is very fast, very close to instant, in fact, in terms of speed. It is truly silent. Silent in the sense that I put it up next to my ear and did a lot of focusing, and I still couldn't hear anything. And it focused very accurately, so no problems there. Sometimes when it comes to tracking a subject with a wide-angle lens, it's a little bit more complicated, particularly if you're trying to shoot at a wider maximum aperture, because a lot of times the subject isn't occupying a big enough part of the frame for the AI tracking to really lock on until it gets relatively close. But a lot of times it doesn't matter so much because the depth of field is going to be big enough that unless you're really focused on the wrong point, the subject may be in focus anyway. And so, I mean, again, I haven't really had the opportunity to test it in like a sports type setting, but focus speed is certainly there. And so if the focus algorithms are doing the job, I don't see why you shouldn't be able to do that. I found that focus accuracy was good whether I was shooting up close, which is nice. Lots of good when it comes to stills. I saw none of the pulsing that I've sometimes seen with wide-angle lenses when shooting at landscape distances and at smaller apertures. It's just really, really good. Very well executed. And so I love that progress for Samyang. And when it comes to the video side of things, I was also impressed with the autofocus performance. The focus pulls are very good and confident. They're smooth. There's no pulsing or visible steps. All of that was very good. Focus breathing is very low from this lens, which is fantastic for video work. It isn't parfocal, and you'll notice here as I zoom in and out that there's moments in that process where things are out of focus before it quickly refocuses. And so if you're looking for a parfocal lens, unfortunately, this is not it. However, what I did find is that when just kind of moving naturally from one subject to another, not kind of focusing a pull by touch, I found that the focus pulls they're nicely cinematic. It's not like this, abrupt kind of thing, but there's just a nice cinematic pull to it. So I actually think this is going to be a really great gimbal lens because of that small compact size. And again, it's short enough that with a lot of gimbals, you could do inception mode or things like that. It's going to be a great vlogging lens because of having a great focal length for that and the ability to zoom, and because the zoom is it's a very small area and the lens is so lightweight, you can zoom in and out and you're not going to have to worry about messing with rebalancing a gimbal. It's going to be such a minor change that the motors are going to be able to compensate for that without any problem. And so I think it's going to be a really, really nice lens for video work for a number of reasons there. How about the image quality itself? The question is how much input does the Schneider-KREUZNACH have on this lens anyway? And I did try to plumb those depths, and I didn't necessarily get a clear picture. It is clear that from both ends of the spectrum that this is a collaboration, that they have worked on that, and it looks like there's at least one other zoom lens that will be coming down the pipeline as a part of this collaboration. But certainly there is some input from the Schneider side of things, and so let's look at what the outcome is. This is an optical design of 15 elements in 11 groups. That includes 5 high refractive index elements, 3 aspherical lenses, and 3 extra low dispersion elements. And so the majority of that optical design is exotic elements. If we look at the MTF, we find that it's a very strong MTF at 14 millimeters, though it's not what you would call flat. It's a bit of up and down. However, all of that up and down is within a very high threshold, and particularly in the center of the frame, it is remarkably sharp, very, very sharp. And then at the 24 millimeter end, it starts off extremely sharp, but it's more of a linear decline towards the corners. Now, if I throw in the Sigma comparison, and remember that the Sigma is, number one, excellent, and it is much, much larger. What we find is that the LK Samyang lens is sharper in the center on both ends of the zoom range. But what I find, whether at 14 millimeters or 24 millimeters, is that while there's not a big difference in the percentage between the two, the Sigma is more consistent. It's more of a flat rather than up and down in its performance. And so I do think that the Sigma is probably a more consistent optical performer in terms of sharpness and contrast. But the two lenses are actually, if you break down the overall percentage in terms of sharpness, they're actually very, very similar to each other. Now, there's the one kind of optical flaw that I can point to here is that there is some very strong barrel distortion at 14 millimeters. I needed a plus 29 to correct for that, and it is somewhat of a mustache pattern. It doesn't correct perfectly when you're trying to do a manual correction. Now, to be fair, the recently released Sony 16mm F1.8, it actually needed even 1% more of distortion correction at, just 16 millimeters, and this being 14 millimeters. And so, there's that. Also, it has very heavy vignette on the 14 millimeter end. I needed a plus 91, not quite maxing it out, but not far from it to correct for that when doing a manual correction. Now, the good news is that it seems like they have managed to have better profile support for this lens than what I've seen necessarily for previous Samyang lenses. And so it seems to me like, number one, you're getting full in-camera support for JPEGs and videos. And so the real world issue is not really much of an issue because of those good in-camera corrections. There is a profile available to download for Lightroom, ACR, things like that, and so that you can correct for raw files. And so, there is some electronic help, but certainly there is some raw, strong distortion there. As you start to zoom in, that goes away, and so by the time you get to the 24 millimeter end, you've actually gone to the tiniest, a -1 of pincushion distortion, and vignette is much lower at just a plus 43. Now, on much more positive aspects, number one, you do have almost no longitudinal style chromatic aberrations, and so that's great, and so that's going to help with contrast. Then wide-angle lenses are far more likely to suffer with the lateral style chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame, and fortunately that did not seem to be a problem either. I didn't see any issues with lateral style chromatic aberration either on my chart or out in real-world use, and so that's fantastic. On the sharpness side of things, I found that at 14 millimeters, it is extremely sharp in the center, extremely sharp. It is still very, very good in the mid-frame, and the corners are relatively good. Good compared to a lot of other wide-angle lenses, but not obviously anywhere near as good as what the center performance is. I was kind of intrigued, and unfortunately, when I did the review of the Sigma, it was so many years ago, it was before my current testing methods. And so I couldn't really use that as a benchmark, not same resolution back then, different process, different chart, etc. But I did go back to the more recent review of the Sony 16-35mm F2.8 Mark II. And that's a G Master lens, a very, very good lens optically. In the center of the frame, the Samyang is actually sharper, even though it is going wider, obviously, than 16 millimeters. And then if I moved over to the corners, I found that the GM lens is brighter in the corners, obviously, but in terms of the sharpness and contrast, it's really kind of a wash between the two lenses. And so that just gives you a benchmark to let you know this is a very, very good optical instrument at 14 millimeters. And so what I found is that as I stopped it down, you don't see a big improvement in a lot of the frame. By f5.6, the corners are looking very, very good. The center, you're basically not going to get any better than what you get at f2.8. However, as you stop down, you will see it just the performance kind of even out across the frame. And so by f5.6, you can get great looking landscape images with detail all across the frame, even on a 61 megapixel body. So that is fantastic. You're going to see the typical issues with diffraction. Diffraction starts to show up by f11, and minimum aperture here is f22. It's going to be pretty obvious by f22 what diffraction has done. I found as I began to zoom into the range that I got a more even performance at 17 and 18 millimeters. Corners are brightening up. A little bit more consistent performance there. 20 millimeters also looking very, very good. Very strong performance. And at 20 millimeters, I would say I saw the sharpest corners of what I've seen very quickly. By about f4, corners looked really great. At 24 millimeters, resolution is obviously still very good, but contrast isn't quite as good at f2.8. I found that if I stopped down to f4, however, that contrast came right back in and images looked really, really good. In fact, I found that I was actually very pleasantly surprised by how good the lens was at 24 millimeters f2.8 in close-up work. And not maybe macro levels of contrast and, the acuity of those fine details, but it really did a very compelling job there. And you can actually get a little bit of bokeh out of this lens because you can focus so closely. And the quality of that background blur is really fairly pleasant for a wide angle lens. So great job there as well. Colors look good out of the lens. I suspect that at least some of the optical glass may have come through Schneider, and we have very, very nice results there. I found that the chroma is very well controlled. Samyang has traditionally done quite well with this, so they tend to be good lenses for shooting astro or night sky, and that's no different here. So this is going to be a really compelling lens, particularly for those that are maybe backpacking out to great locations to do astro work. This package is obviously going to be very compelling for that. I also found that flare resistance, a bit of a mixed bag. The biggest thing that I noticed is that 14 millimeters, if you compose in a certain way, you're going to get a kind of a halo around the moon kind of light leak effect towards the very edge of the frame if you compose in just a certain way. If I zoomed in a bit, that went away, obviously, and you couldn't see it. However, I would say that the more you stop the lens down, if I shoot it, a lot of times I test wide open and at f11, definitely at f11, I saw more flare artifacts, more pronounced flare artifacts. And in the middle of that range, kind of the more typical place I actually shoot, f5.6, for example, for landscapes, not really much of a big deal. And so, there are some potential issues, but they are avoidable there. So my conclusion is this. I think that this is a very triumphant return for Samyang, or now LK Samyang. It gives basically all of the Sigma's performance in a cheaper, lighter, smaller, and more versatile package. The ability to use filters, I think, could be a game changer for certain people. And also, as I've mentioned, the compact nature of allowing people to take that into more spaces because it is easy to bring along, I think is going to be a very compelling reason. The question, I guess, to be answered is the market going to be ready for a $1,200 Samyang lens, even if it has Schneider branding on it? And I guess we're going to find out what the market will bear. It does seem that Samyang, LK Samyang, still needs to work on a little bit of their North American distribution and maybe iron out a few of those tweaks. However, if you can get your hands on this lens, I think it's a pretty fantastic lens. I'm personally very, very intrigued by this lens and the package that it comes in. Now, if you want more information, you can either check out my full text review that's linked in the description down below. There's linkage to an image gallery if you want to see more photos. And if you want a deeper dive into the optical performance, well, stay tuned with me right now, and we're going to jump into that together. Okay, we'll start by taking a quick look at this focal range. And so as you can see, we're going from 14 millimeters to 24 millimeters. And so that's a lot of different framing options for the same scene. As mentioned, our worst optical flaw in this lens is the amount of barrel distortion and vignette that's present at 14 millimeters. So you can see it is strongly pronounced in terms of the barrel distortion, and you can see after I've tried to manually correct it, it has a little bit of that wavy mustache pattern there, and so it doesn't correct perfectly. You have to correct the centers, you end up overcorrecting the corners. Fortunately, the correction profile does a cleaner job of that because it is tailored to this. And then the vignette is a plus 92, which is a lot. And the one thing I don't like is there's just almost a little bit of like a discoloration where it's whatever, the color balance isn't quite the same there in the corners. Again, it doesn't seem to be as much of an issue out in real world shots. Now, when we get to the telephoto end, we can see that all of that distortion has essentially gone away, and it's almost completely neutral. The tiniest amount of pincushion distortion. It's not even worth correcting, but you can with a -1. Vignette is much lower at a +43 to get this correct result in the corners. Longitudinal style chromatic aberrations are not a problem. You can see very neutral before and quite neutral after, tiniest bit of green fringing there. If I take a look here on this SLR, we can see as we look towards any of the shiny and reflective surfaces elsewhere, very, very little fringing to see. It does a really good job of correcting for all of that. This shot is another in which often I'll see some kind of fringing before and after the plane of focus. You can see not only is it there, but there's also really good detail and contrast, holding up very nicely. Not an issue with the lateral style chromatic aberrations as well. A nice clean result there. So really good marks on that front. Now taking a look at resolution 14mm F2.8, this is 61 megapixels on a Sony a7R Mark V. The center of the frame at 200% magnification. It looks fantastic. Contrast and detail are just right at the top of the chart. Likewise, in the mid frame, it still looks very, very good. A little less contrast, but you can see it's still looking really excellent, particularly at such a high level of magnification. Quite consistent from this corner to this corner. As we look down here, we can see that really, truth be told, even the corners look quite good here. So for a comparison point, here is the Sony 16-35mm G Master Mark II. In the center of the frame, both at 200% magnification, you can see that it's the Samyang that has just a little bit more pop to it, a little better contrast, a little better detail. If we look in the mid frame, the two are very, very close. I would say the GM maybe takes a little bit of an edge there, and down here towards the edge, the GM delivers a brighter result, but in terms of the actual sharpness and contrast, I'm going to say that the Samyang's probably a little bit better. Now, as you stop the Samyang down at 14 millimeters, you're not really going to get any more in the center of the frame. You've already got basically maximum from wide open. What you will see is the corners get a lot brighter, as you can see. So a lot of that vignette goes away, and so it just allows them to look cleaner and better. By f5.6, you're starting to get really clean right off into the very, very corners. So nice result there. So for a little real-world perspective here at 100% magnification, 61 megapixels, you can see everywhere. You can look here in the frame, fine detail, great colors. So you move off towards the edge of the frame, it does get a little bit softer, and part of that is due to maybe just a little bit of stretching towards the edge there. But here on the right side, you know, it's still good. It's just not as exceptionally good as when you get into this zone here. I found that I could put on even a 10-stop ND filter, as I've done here, to slow down the water effect and give me a nice long exposure. You can see that even with that, detail is holding up. It looks fantastic. I mean, really, really super sharp. So great result there. I mean, obviously these are blowing around a bit in that long exposure, but I'm able to get that really great look with the water. Being able to simply filter this is such a huge advantage. You take a shot like this where, you know, the waters are just kind of troubled. To be able to get that long exposure look is fantastic. And we can see here, comparing side by side, that there's still lots of detail left. We're not losing resolution contrast just by using the filter to produce a long exposure. Now, as per usual, as you stop the lens on down by about f11, it's starting to get a little softer due to diffraction, still really good. By f22, which is the minimum aperture, you can see that it definitely softens everything up. Moving on to 17 and 18 millimeters there, you can see that center looks very good wide open, just fantastically sharp. Stopping down doesn't really make it sharper, it gives it just a little bit more contrast. In some other places, however, here like in the mid, you can see that there's just a little bit more pop, stop down, and into the corners, just a little bit brighter and a little bit more detail, but already just really, really good. Here at 20 millimeters, we can see that the center looks great from wide open. Stopping down, again, doesn't really improve the center. It will give you a little bit more pop in the mid frame. And here is definitely the best corner performance I've seen. At f4, it looks fantastic right in the corners. Finally, at 24 millimeters, you can see that the detail is still really good, but the contrast is a little bit lower. Stopping down to f4 definitely gives us more contrast there in the center of the frame. In the mid frame here as well, it just gives a little bit more pop to everything. Up close performance here at 24 millimeters f2.8 is really quite good. There's lots of detail being shown there. Really quite impressive overall. Also, color rendition, colors look good, nice levels of saturation. As you can see, really nice detail there. I thought that this image looked really, really rich as well. Colors looked fantastic. Here we can see, as you get close to a subject, you know, the background blur is really quite nice for a wide angle lens. It blurs off quite nicely. Even this transition zone is handled well, and the ability to get close to subjects, you know, you can see that really fine depth of field there. Just gives you a lot more creative options when you're out taking photos to get different kinds of shots. Again, this is in 24mm f2.8, looks really quite good overall. And here, like the real world contrast in this image, I think looks quite good for being close. You can see that narrow plane of focus holds up well. And then the bleed off to defocus is surprisingly good. Here again, this is obviously a tiny, tiny depth of field, as we can see here. But looking at the specular highlights, they look decent. You know, sun is handled okay in this, the flare here. And that kind of leads us to, it's not as great in some other settings here, particularly at smaller apertures like f11. You can see a little bit more of that, you know, ghosting artifacts. Also seeing it here. Here's that halo around the sun effect that you can see, and you have to, you know, either zoom in a bit to avoid that or just compose differently. I was trying to maximize it, so I'm trying to create the flaws. Hopefully you're not going to try to do that. But here, obviously looking better. This shot, I mean, there's a little bit of ghosting, but not enough to mess it up. And here, this is a more typical f5.6. This is like the actual way I would shoot with the lens, and you can see there's a tiny bit of ghosting pattern. No big deal there. Finally, when it comes to coma, you can see star points very crisp in the center of the frame. As we pan off towards the edge, I mean, this wasn't a great night for shooting astro, but we can see that there is very little amounts of coma. They're not kind of growing wings or looking like insects, just a tiny bit of stretching. Overall, however, this is a very nice lens for shooting the night sky. So a lot of optical strengths and just a few weaknesses here. So while this isn't a flawless lens, the fact that they have been able to take this focal length and aperture combination and really miniaturize it so effectively while not compromising on the optics, I think is a very, very interesting proposal here. And so hopefully the deep dive has helped you to appreciate whether or not this might or not be the lens for you. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day and let the light in.